Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sean Lestrange and I'll be your MC for this wonderful occasion to commemorate the USS Bullhead. First of all, can I please welcome the dignitaries who are here with us today, to Consul General David Gaynor of the United States Consulate in Perth, to the Honourable Daniel Caddy MLC, Member of the Legislative Council of the North Metropolitan Region, representing the Honourable Paul Papalia MLA, the State Minister for Defence Issues. Mr Alec Coles, Chief Executive Officer at the WA Museum. Mr Michael Parker, Chief Executive Officer at Fremantle Ports. Mr Peter O'Donoghue and representatives of the Submarine Association of Australia WA branch. And of course, welcome to you all, ladies and gentlemen, particularly serving and ex-serving Defence Force personnel and friends and family members of the man who turned this vision of a memorial into a reality, Tim Baldock and his wife Leonie. An overview of the memorial. The USS Bullhead was a Baldock-class submarine and one of 52 American submarines lost in World War II. Tim has asked me to, first of all, just make a note. You'll hear some noises around us today, that there is construction work going on, so apologies for that if it makes a bit too much noise. But today's date is significant as it is the 76th anniversary of the loss of the USS Bullhead. The memorial benefactor, Tim Baldock, had hoped to have this event last year to mark the 75th anniversary of the sinking of the boat, and had hoped to have family members associated with the crew of the Bullhead in attendance from the United States here with us. But unfortunately, with COVID doing what COVID has been doing over the last 18 months, it's been a very difficult time, and travel restrictions have made it really hard to get people here. So Tim made the decision to not postpone this event any longer. It is important to commemorate and remember the sailors, and so we're going ahead with it today. If I could please call forward Peter O'Donoghue, who will conduct the acknowledgement to country and provide the submariner's perspective. Peter was a petty officer, an electrical technician in the Submarines. He's retired. He's president of the Submarines Association of Australia, WA branch. He joined the Navy when he was 16 years old. He did 22 years in the Navy, with 14 of those on submarines. It says on submarines, it really should be in submarines. You wouldn't want to be on them when they're underwater, would you? After leaving the Navy, he spent 23 years maintaining Collins-class submarines at Henderson. Welcome to you, Peter.
Good morning. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting to pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have contributed to the defence of Australia in times of peace and war, and I extend that respect to other Indigenous people who are present. I'm going to read out something I've written about the submariner's bond. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine, if you will, living in a tube some 7 metres in diameter and 80 metres long, crammed full of machinery, fuel, enough explosives to obliterate you in an instant, and 70 other people in the harshest environment of all, the sea. Not just the sea, but the depths of the sea, for up to 70 days at a time. Now, in this tube you work in a 6-hour on and a 6-hour off watch system. Half of the time in white lighting, clear lighting like now, and half the time in red or black lighting, where you can barely see your hand 10 centimetres in front of your face, all whilst up to 100 metres or more below the surface, with only a thin steel skin to fight off the pressures of an ocean that is just waiting for an error of judgment, operation, or to find a structural weakness in that tube. We read and hear about the bond that great football cricket teams have, how they talk about mateship and courage, and that special bond formed by achieving the pinnacle of their sport. Submariners have that bond, but even more so, and at a much more intense level. It is a bond forged by implicit trust. Trust that the person standing next to you, no matter their rank or nowadays their gender, is competent and capable and able to react at a moment's notice to any type of emergency that the sea or the submarine can throw at you, and there are many. That bond doesn't only extend to your shipmates or on your submarine, but to submariners of all nations, because no matter the cause or nation they are serving, they all face or have faced the same common enemy as you, the ocean. And you have an intimate knowledge of what they are and have faced. When tragedy strikes, it is as it recently did with the Argentinian submarine San Juan and the Indonesian submarine Nagala. That bond is irrevocably forged for eternity. And although you do not know what caused their loss, you know they fought to the end to bring their submarine to the surface and safety. And you grieve for them and their families and wonder if you were there, could you have done anything different? Added to the everyday dangers of operating a submarine, I can only imagine the additional stress and pressure faced by those who served at times of war. Once you have gained the required competency, are you awarded your dolphins, a simple pin that is worn on your left breast above your medals to signify the competency. And although there are many different types of pins from many countries, they all show that you are qualified in submarines and signify to others who wear that pin that you are one of them and share that same bond. I'll finish with a quote from Winston Churchill. Of all the branches of men in the forces, there is none which shows more devotion and faces grimmer perils than the submariners. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and that's probably why I'm an infantry officer in the Army and not a submariner. I'll now call on Honourable Dan Caddy MLC, the member for the North Metropolitan Region, who is representing the Honourable Paul Papalia, the State Minister for Defence Issues, to say a few words. Thanks, Dan.
Good morning, all. I'd commence by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting this morning, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and acknowledge their connection to the land, and especially this morning, their connection to the waterways, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm very pleased to be given the invitation to speak at this event on behalf of the Honourable Paul Papalia, Minister for Veterans Issues. And before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the US Consul General, Mr. David Gaynor again, and Colonel Sean Lestrange, who you've heard from, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years, an outstanding contributor to both the ADF and to the state of Western Australia. WA has a proud and long-standing history of maritime capability, and Fremantle Harbour has hosted many Australian and Allied Navy vessels on active service. As the largest submarine base in the Southern Hemisphere during the Second World War, Fremantle had a key role. The port accommodated, I'm told, more than 170 submarines from the USA and from other naval forces from around the world. Now, Australia and the US share an important alliance, formalised through the ANZUS Treaty in 1951. More than 60 years later, the treaty remains the foundation of our security relationship, standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States. The USS Bullhead Memorial demonstrates and pays tribute to the qualities and the commitment that is needed to not only defend our nation, but to unite such an alliance. The government is thankful for the efforts and contributions of the Baldock family, and in particular, Tim, in continuing the importance of this alliance by establishing this memorial. It's roughly 3 years, I think 3 or 4 years since I first met Tim. He came to me as a political staffer, as I was then, with the idea of this memorial. I am particularly pleased to see it here today. And Tim, Fortress Fremantle, your book is one of the few books that sits on the coffee table in my electorate office at the moment. This memorial will stand as a constant reminder of the efforts of the US Navy during the Second World War and the strength of the alliance which continues to this day. The government, as part of our Diversified WA economic plan, sees defence industry as a critical component of this ongoing quest This is why WA is keen to support the national interest by becoming the sustainment and maintenance hub for all RAN submarines and frigates here in WA at the Australian Marine Complex. None of this would be possible without the dedication of our current and former serving members of the Royal Australian Navy. And veterans and their families are an important element of our defence and defence industry strategic plan as well. We honour their service and recognise the considerable skills they bring to the community. So in conclusion, projects like this are important. They are critically important to veterans, they're important to veterans' families, and they're important to the community and to the country. It's through remembering these stories that we remember the cost of war.
Thanks, Dan. And before I introduced Tim to come up and speak to us today, he asked me to say a special thanks to key supporters of this project. To Alec Cole, the CEO of the WA Museum, who Tim met initially after meeting with Peter Tinley and Dan Caddy. To Peter Donoghue, who assisted with the design of the memorial itself. To Gil Harrison from the WA Maritime Museum for her support from the very beginning of discussions. To Michael Parker, CEO of Fremantle Ports. To Neil Turner, the memorial architect. And to Natalie Scott, who has organised today's event. Congratulations and thank you to you all. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tim Baldock, who I met at the book launch of Fortress Fremantle. A lovely man who has a lot to offer the community of Western Australia and continues to do so. Tim is a CEO of a private investment company, an author, volunteer and keen military historian, particularly relating to Western Australia. And as I said, his book, Fortress Fremantle, was published in 2018. In fact, Tim became a Rottnest volunteer guide in 2010. As part of his training, he learned about the history of the defences of the port of Fremantle during World War II and the significance of Fremantle as a submarine base, being the world's second largest at the time. Upon learning that the Bullhead was sunk on the same day as the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Tim says they're around about 12 minutes apart, he felt compelled to write a book about this and dedicate it to the memory of the crew of the Bullhead. In addition to Tim's passion for significant local history, and in this memorial, a zeal for naval history, he and Leonie have strong family ties to the Navy, with their son Max, aged 19, serving as a midshipman, maritime warfare officer with the Royal Australian Navy today. Currently completing his tertiary and military studies at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. He's spent time on the ships HMAS Adelaide and HMAS Stuart and the submarine HMAS Collins. He is hoping to achieve his goal of captaining a frigate or destroyer in the Australian Navy. So strong family ties to the Navy, strong connection to the significance of today's event. I welcome to the podium Tim Baldock.
Thank you, Sean. The Bullhead was the last US naval vessel lost in World War II. On 31st of July 1945, she left the port of Fremantle, where we are meeting today, to commence what would be her final war patrol. Her loss on August 6th was on the same day as the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. A few days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Diplomatic channels went into overdrive. The Japanese put out peace feelers and it became apparent that they were going to surrender, which they did on August the 15th. On August the 13th, 2 days before the final surrender, dispatches were sent out to all American submarines to break off any engagement that they may have been involved in and to return immediately to their home base. All submarines acknowledged the message except the Bullhead, so the Navy knew that something was wrong. It wasn't until after the war, when a forensic examination of Japanese military reports was done, that the Navy was able to conclude what had probably happened. The Bullhead was heading towards the South China Sea, which is where these boats had the primary task of sinking Japanese merchant ships. Her mission was to rendezvous with two other American submarines, the Capitaine and the Puffer, near the Spratly Islands, and then to intercept the Japanese shipping routes. However, on the way there, off the coast of Bali, she was spotted by a lone Japanese plane who released two 500-pound bombs on her. The pilot reported a direct hit and circled in the area for a period of time, then seeing gushes of oil and bubbles and no target remaining, indicating that the submarine had been sunk. We'll never really know what happened that day, but we do know from the pilot's report that the attack happened early in the morning around 8 a.m. It's assumed that the submarine was on the surface, the plane was coming from the east with the sun behind it, and that, coupled with the noise from the diesel engines, meant that the lookouts didn't spot the plane until it was too late. The effectiveness of the boat's radar would have also been limited due to her proximity to the Balinese coast and nearby mountain peaks. They would immediately have tried to dive to escape, but were unable to get down in time and take evasive action. So the boat was lost with all 84 crew on board and remains off the coast of Bali at the bottom of the sea to this day. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge somebody whose name does not appear on the memorial today, and that's a man by the name of Commander Walter T. Griffith. When the Bullhead took to sea, she was captained by Lieutenant Commander Edward Holt. Holt was on his 11th war patrol, and at the age of 30 was one of the US Navy's more experienced and capable commanders. He had considerable submarine experience, previously skippering the Groper, the Bayer and the Sea Lion. But Holt was not the usual commander of the Bullhead. The Bullhead was Griffith's boat. Griffith was also a very experienced commander and had previously captained the USS Bowfin, which was one of the Navy's most successful submarines in the war and spent a lot of its time operating out of Fremantle. In fact, on one war patrol, the Bowfin, under the command of Griffith, sank 70,000 tonnes of enemy shipping, which was a record that stood for 2 years. He was also extremely popular with his crew, and when he took command of the Bullhead, a number of the crew requested transfers off the Bowfin to continue to be with him. Griffith returned to Fremantle in June 1945 after his final patrol on the Bullhead, suffering from dysentery and extreme fatigue. The boat had been at sea for more than 40 days, and Griffith had barely slept the entire time. A correspondent who met him here at the port on his arrival commented, "He's only 33, but he looks like he's lived 1,000 years." He was sent to a naval hospital in Guam to recuperate. Holt was given command of the Bullhead for her final mission, and Griffith learned of the Bullhead's loss while in the hospital. Griffith was beside himself with grief. He could not believe that he had been spared that day and that his crew had all perished. He blamed himself and wondered whether, had he been the one in command that day, the outcome might have been different. He would say, "My boys shouldn't have gone down without me. Also young, I should have been with them." The Navy provided him with honours and promotions, but it only seemed to make him worse. He continued to suffer this torment after the war, and in 1966, 21 years after the loss of the Bullhead, he took his own life. I'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to the enormous contribution that the submarine force played in the final victory over the Empire of Japan. In fact, I don't think there's been a time in modern military history where one branch of an armed service has had as big an effect on the final outcome as the US submarine force did in World War II. In total, they accounted for over half of all Japanese shipping losses and imposed an economic stranglehold on that nation. Only 16,000 men, or 1.6% of the US Navy strength, served on submarines. In total, 375 officers, as well as 3,131 enlisted men perished, the equivalent of 22% of the entire force, making it the highest loss rate of any branch of the armed services. However, there was no shortage of volunteers for the submarine service, and it wasn't just the higher rates of pay on offer, it was a feeling of belonging to an elite force that brought them in. In fact, at the conclusion of the war, the US Strategic Bombing Survey was completed, and it was commissioned by the Air Force because they assumed it would rule heavily in their favour. However, it concluded that the war against shipping was the most decisive single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and logistics support of Japanese naval and military power. The submarines accounted for the majority of vessel sinkings. This is the third memorial in Fremantle now recognising the submarine service, but I hope it's not the last. The Bullhead may have been the last boat lost, but a lot more that left these waters behind me were lost too. And I hope that one day we might have a memorial to each of them. Thank you all for coming and sharing in this occasion today. I'd particularly like to thank all of you who attended my book launch back in 2018, where I first proposed the idea of a memorial, for joining me on the 76th anniversary of her sinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I'll now call up Peter O'Donoghue to read the Naval Ode, including a time of reflective silence. Peter.
They have no grave but the cruel sea, no flowers lay at their head. A rusting hulk is their tombstone, a fast on the ocean bed. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. The going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Now it gives me pleasure to call forward the Consul General of the United States, David Gaynor, to say a few words. And following the Consul's remarks today, he'll be joined by Tim to unveil the USS Bullhead Memorial.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me this morning to this wonderful ceremony. I'm honored to be here and honored to be taking part. First off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the organizers of this event and friends and dignitaries, including Sean and Dan Caddy and Peter and Alec Cole from the museum, and especially Tim for all of his work in making this possible. We're gathered here today to acknowledge the bravery and sacrifice of the 84 U.S. soldiers aboard the USS Bullhead when it sunk 76 years ago. Having departed from here, Fremantle would have been one of the last friendly sights the sailors saw before departing their patrol. Their sacrifice reflects the mutual trust and respect that our nations hold for one another, a respect that is steeped in history. Few know that our relationship stretches back to the 1880s, with Americans working in whaling stations in Albany, not Albany. We call it Albany in the United States. That maybe is one of the small differences between our two countries, as well as gold mines in Kalgoorlie. In 1918, Americans joined the First World War. It was then that Australian and U.S. troops first fought together under the command of Australian Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, who stated that, quote, that soldiers of the United States and Australia should have thus been associated for the first time in such close cooperation on the battlefield is an historic event of such significance that will live forever in the annals of our respected nations. Indeed, Monash was right, and the partnership of which he spoke has remained true ever since. Australia and the U.S. have fought side by side in every major conflict since World War I. From the Korean Peninsula to the jungles of Vietnam, and most recently the mountains of Afghanistan, Australian and American servicemen and women have served together, bound by a common set of ideals. While our 20-year-long cooperation in Afghanistan has really recently drawn to an end, the bond between our countries remains true to the day. Today, just a short drive from here down WA's beautiful coastline, you'll find American naval officers at Garden Island. Much further up the coast, U.S. Air Force officers are based in Exmouth, and there are, of course, U.S. Marines that rotate through Darwin. Just last week, we wrapped up our largest biennial exercise, which of course is with Australia, Exercise Talisman Sabre, a significant 2-week bilateral training exercise where our forces were cooperating and learning from each other in Queensland. This underscores our continuing ability to carry out integrated, high-end maritime operations with our allies. Later this year, we will mark the 70th anniversary of our ANZUS Treaty. Signed at the Presidio in San Francisco on September 1st, 1951, the ANZUS Treaty has served as one of the bedrocks of our relationship and cemented what we all know to be true. We have always been there for each other, and we always will. While the military cooperation between the United States and Australia is often the focus of our alliance, we of course cooperate in so many other fields. The Fulbright Treaty, which was signed in 1949, actually preceded the ANZUS Treaty, and it paved the way for American and Australian students and scholars to study abroad in both of our countries. In 2019, we saw the largest contingents of students and scholars participate in the program since its inception, and it is one of our largest exchange programs in the world. So if you know of any good scholars and students, it's a great time to apply for the Fulbright program. Last year, we celebrated the 15th anniversary of our Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, with a total two-way investment surpassing 1.5 trillion Australian dollars. Australia and the US alike continue to benefit and prosper from our free trade agreement. But our countries are not just joined by military and economic cooperation, we are also joined in purpose. Following the leadership of our Australian partners, the US wants to advance our cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. We want to see freedom of the seas and skies, foster business-led economic recoveries, cooperate on global challenges, and promote rules-based liberal democracies. This has all been made more important due, of course, to the COVID-19 pandemic. That joint purpose, working towards a secure and prosperous region, has echoed for decades, from the enduring relationship we see now to the war patrol of the USS Bullhead in 1945. To quote U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, my boss, quote, "The world is safer when we have friends, partners, and allies." And I have worked 3 times now on the US-Australia relationship, and I can tell you we have no greater friend than Australia. Can I conclude with a thanks to Tim Baldock, without who this memorial would not exist. Tim, your generosity and work exemplifies what the US-Australia Alliance is about: cooperation and joint purpose. This memorial is a touching tribute to the bravery and service of those sailors who lost their lives in 1945. It is my hope that the descendants of those sailors will, hopefully, COVID willing, visit this memorial with a profound sense of pride. This has only really been made possible by your generosity, Tim, and all of your other colleagues. So on behalf of the United States government, I thank you. Thank you. I love it. For photos?
Thanks so much, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, the recognition of foreign sailors, allies of ours, who died in combat and who had a strong connection to Australia, and more specifically to our home port of Fremantle, is a noble endeavour. To this, we thank Tim for his drive and energy to make this memorial project a reality. And we thank Tim and Leonie for their philanthropy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all now invited to enjoy morning tea in the museum. Thank you for your participation in today's unveiling of the USS Bullhead Memorial. Well done.